My son called 11 hours before our anniversary trip. Cancel your flight. We need you. Then his text landed, don't be selfish. Family comes first. The same words my husband said to me the week before he disappeared. I was standing in our bedroom in Boise, holding two cardigans, one blue, one gray, trying to decide something small because the big things had gotten too heavy to hold all at once. Frank was already in bed with his reading glasses pushed up into his hair, marking up our printed itinerary for Cannon Beach with a yellow highlighter like he was studying for an exam. 7 nights. Reservations booked 4 months in advance. Our 30th wedding anniversary. 5 years of saying, not yet, but soon. While grandchildren arrived and hips got replaced and somebody's roof always needed fixing before we could. Soon had finally come. I had genuinely started to believe it. Then Cody's name lit up my phone on the dresser, the screen glowing against the dark wood. Hey, Mom. His voice already knew how this was supposed to end, the particular flatness of someone reciting lines they'd rehearsed on the drive home from work. Brittany's training starts Monday. We need you for the kids all week. Our flight is at 8 in the morning, I said, still holding both cardigans, my thumb running over the buttons of the blue one like it might anchor me to something. I know when your flight is. That line hit me harder than yelling would have. He knew. Brittany had received her training schedule from the hospital 2 weeks earlier. She was finishing her certification to become a surgical technician, a genuinely wonderful step for their family, something I was proud of her for. Nobody had asked me 2 weeks earlier when there was still time to plan around it. They'd waited until the night before our flight, betting that guilt would accomplish what actual planning hadn't. A text landed on my screen before I could even respond to him out loud. Don't be selfish. Family comes first. Cancel your trip. The cardigan slid out of my hands and landed on the carpet, blue and gray pooling together at my feet. Frank looked up from the itinerary. Everything okay? No, I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. But something just got very clear. My name is Carol Hendricks. I'm 58 years old. I taught 4th grade in the Boise School District for 26 years before retiring last spring, and until that Thursday night in July, I would have told you, without hesitation, that being needed by my family was the single most important job I had left in this world. I raised Cody mostly on my own for the first 6 years of his life, while Frank finished a long stint in the Army and then a longer stint building his contracting business from nothing but a used pickup truck and a business card he'd designed himself on a library computer. Cody grew up watching me say yes to everything. Yes to bake sales, yes to carpools, yes to staying up until 2 a.m. sewing a Halloween costume because I'd promised him a specific dinosaur and refused to let him down. I don't regret a single one of those years. But somewhere along the way, without either of us quite noticing it happen, yes stopped being a gift I chose to give and became something closer to an assumption Cody carried into adulthood. The quiet, unexamined belief that his mother's time existed primarily as a resource to be allocated wherever his life needed it most. I can trace the shift, looking back, to a handful of specific moments I didn't recognize as significant at the time. His college graduation, when I drove 6 hours through a snowstorm to be there, and he mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he'd assumed I would come regardless of the weather, as though the 6 hours and the snow and the risk of it simply didn't factor into his expectation. His wedding, when I quietly picked up the difference between what he and Brittany had budgeted and what the venue actually cost, because I couldn't stand the thought of them starting a marriage in debt. And nobody ever mentioned that check again, not out of ingratitude exactly, but because it had simply been absorbed into the category of things Mom takes care of. Each individual moment felt small and reasonable in isolation. Stacked together over 3 decades, they built something closer to a job description nobody had ever actually offered me the chance to negotiate. He married Brittany 9 years ago, a smart, warm woman who worked full-time at a pediatric clinic while raising their 2 kids, Emma, 7, and Miles, 4. I loved being a grandmother more than I'd loved almost anything in my adult life. I watched Emma and Miles 2 or 3 days most weeks, no questions asked, because I wanted to, because time with them felt like the best possible use of a Tuesday afternoon. That willingness, I understand now, is exactly what made this particular ultimatum feel so reasonable to Cody when he issued it. He wasn't asking a favor of someone who occasionally helped. He was making a demand of someone he'd quietly come to think of as infrastructure. Frank noticed it before I did, actually, though he'd never pushed the point too hard. A year earlier, after I'd canceled a weekend trip to visit my sister in Spokane, because Cody needed help with a plumbing emergency that turned out to be, on closer inspection, a slow bathroom sink drain he could have hauled any plumber in the city to fix. Frank had simply said over dinner that night, "You know you're allowed to let some things be someone else's problem." I'd laughed it off at the time. I wish I'd listened sooner. Cody called back at 10:22 that night. I remember the exact time because I was staring at the clock on the nightstand, willing it to move slower, as if slowing time down might somehow buy me an answer I felt good about. He laid it all out again, and every single word he said was true. The babysitter Brittany had lined up for backup had canceled that afternoon. Their mortgage payment had gone up $340 a month after their adjustable rate reset in June. Brittany genuinely could not miss a single day of this training without risking her spot in the certification cohort, which only ran twice a year. None of it was manufactured. None of it was exaggerated for effect. That was exactly what made saying no so difficult. There was no villain to point to, no lie to catch him in, just an honest, stressful week of parenting logistics that had landed, structurally, on the one week I'd finally finally claimed for myself. I hear you, I told him, my hand pressed flat against the cool wall of the hallway where I'd walked to take the call, out of Frank's earshot, though I'm not sure now why I thought I needed privacy for this. And I'm still not canceling. Silence stretched out long enough that I checked the screen to see if the call had dropped. Then his voice came back, and it had gone cold in a way I hadn't heard from him since he was 17, and I'd taken his car keys after a speeding ticket. Fine. Just remember this when you need something from us. For 30 years, not just as his mother, but as a daughter, a sister, a woman who had spent her whole life absorbing other people's emergencies as her own. That sentence would have flattened me instantly. I would have already been mentally packing a bag. I would have been rehearsing my apology to Frank, my stomach already twisting into the specific knot it always found whenever I disappointed someone I loved in service of someone else who needed me more. Instead, standing in that hallway in my socks, I said, "I'll remember you said that." I hung up before he could respond. Frank capped his highlighter when I walked back into the bedroom, his eyebrows raised in a silent question. "We're going?" I looked down at the dark phone in my hand, feeling my heartbeat slowly returning to something like normal. "Yes," I said, "we're going." The phone lit up steadily for the next several hours. Brittany sent a chain of messages, sitters she'd already called who weren't available, a half-day option at Emma's summer camp that would still leave a 4-hour gap, a coworker who might be able to help but hadn't confirmed. Every proposed solution was structured around making things easier for them, never once considering what it would cost us to build our trip back from scratch with 11 hours notice. I read the first 4 messages. Then I turned the phone face down on the nightstand and set my alarm for 5:15 a.m. I didn't sleep well. I want to be honest about that, because I think there's a version of this story where I make myself sound more resolved than I actually felt lying in the dark next to Frank's steady breathing, running through every version of what might happen if I really got on that plane. I pictured Emma's face if nobody could pick her up from camp. I pictured Brittany, exhausted, at 6 a.m. on her first training day, resenting me the entire 8-hour shift. I pictured Cody telling this story to his in-laws someday, the version where his mother chose a beach over her own grandchildren. Around 3 a.m., I got up and stood in the hallway outside Frank's home office, where a framed photo from our wedding still hung slightly crooked on the wall. The two of us, 28 years old, standing outside a small chapel in Coeur d'Alene, both of us laughing at something the photographer had said just before the shutter clicked. I hadn't looked at that photo carefully in years, the way you stop seeing things that have hung in the same spot too long. I looked at it for a long time that night, at the specific, uncomplicated happiness on both our faces, and thought about how much of the version of myself in that photograph I'd slowly handed away, one reasonable request at a time, over 3 decades of being needed. I also pictured myself 30 years from now, unable to remember a single detail about Cannon Beach because I'd never actually gone. At 5:22 a.m., standing in the kitchen with a mug of coffee I wasn't drinking so much as holding for warmth, I read Cody's last message of the night. "If you get on that plane, don't call us again." Frank watched me over the rim of his own mug, not saying anything, giving me the specific kind of quiet he'd perfected over 31 years of marriage. Present, but not pushing. "Still ready?" he finally asked. I took one slow breath, feeling it move all the way down into my chest before I answered. Yes. We drove to the Boise airport before sunrise. The road's nearly empty, the sky still that deep blue black that hasn't decided yet whether it's night or morning. I carried my phone in my hand the entire drive like it was something alive, something that might bite me if I set it down, but I didn't reopen the thread. At the gate, with 20 minutes before boarding, I switched it to airplane mode and slid it into the bottom of my purse. The gate agent called our zone over the intercom, and I remember the strange, small relief of a stranger's voice announcing something as ordinary as a boarding group. No ultimatums in it, no guilt, just a flight number and a departure time that had nothing to do with anyone's mortgage or training schedule. I handed over my boarding pass with a hand that had finally, somewhere between the kitchen and the gate, stopped shaking. When we lifted off from Boise, I braced myself for the guilt to arrive and swallow me whole, the way it always had before, the specific nauseated dread I associated with disappointing my family. It didn't come. What arrived instead was quiet, steady, in a way that surprised me more than the silence itself. Somewhere over eastern Oregon, watching the wrinkled brown hills give way to green as we crossed toward the coast, I found myself thinking clearly, for maybe the first time in my adult life, Cody's mortgage was real, but it wasn't my emergency to solve. Brittany's training genuinely mattered, but it didn't erase 30 years of my own marriage. My grandchildren were loved, deeply, by me and by their parents both, but love was never supposed to mean I only got to live my own life once everyone else around me had already been made comfortable first. I didn't come to that realization on the plane, not really. I think it had been building for years, underneath the surface of every, of course no problem, every rearranged doctor's appointment, every canceled lunch with my own friends because someone in the family needed me more urgently. The flight just happened to be where the thought finally finished forming, 30,000 feet above a stretch of Oregon I'd never seen before, next to a husband who'd waited 5 years for this trip without ever once making me feel guilty for the years I'd said not yet. We landed in Portland to 19 unread messages. The crisis, it turned out, had survived without me. Costly, apparently. Brittany had to pay a premium rate to a last-minute sitter she found through her clinic's employee resource group, someone named Denise who came recommended by 3 separate coworkers and charged nearly double the going rate for the week. Messy, Cody. Miles had a meltdown on day 2 that Cody described in one message as an absolute disaster, though by day 4, the same thread mentioned Miles and Denise baking cookies together like old friends, full of resentment, at least on Cody's end, if the tone of his texts was any indication. But it survived. Brittany made every single day of her training. The kids were fed, bathed, and reasonably intact. Cody's final message from that first day simply read, "Managing." I read through the full chain of 19 messages slowly, standing at the shuttle stop, and noticed something I hadn't expected to notice: how quickly the tone shifted once the actual week began. The angry, ultimatum-laced texts from Thursday night gave way, by Sunday, to something closer to logistics. Denise's hourly rate, Emma's need for a specific stuffed rabbit at bedtime, a reminder that Miles was allergic to a particular brand of sunscreen. Nobody sent another message about selfishness after that first night. It was as though the emergency, once it actually had to be solved by the people it belonged to, simply became a week like any other hard week. Inconvenient, tiring, survivable. Buried underneath all of it, one more message, from Brittany, not Cody. Emma asked why you didn't come. I stood outside the rental car shuttle stop in the cold, damp Pacific air and read that sentence 3 times, my breath fogging slightly in front of my face. Frank took my suitcase out of my hand without a word, the way he does when he can tell I need both hands free for something other than luggage. Someday, I whispered, mostly to myself, Emma will understand. Frank set the suitcase down and put his hand on my shoulder, solid and warm even through my jacket. You don't have to defend having one week, Carol. For the first time in 30 years, standing in a rental car parking lot 400 miles from home, I actually believed that sentence instead of just wanting to. We stayed the full 7 days. Gray waves rolling in steady and enormous against Haystack Rock. Bowls of clam chowder in small restaurants with fogged-up windows and a view of nothing but weather. Mornings with coffee that belonged only to us, with no one else's crisis waiting to be solved before either of us had finished our first cup. I called Dr. Marisol Feldman, a family therapist I'd actually started seeing quietly that spring. Not because anything was wrong, exactly, but because a friend from my old teaching job had recommended her after I mentioned, almost in passing, that I sometimes felt more like a service than a person to my own family. I'd had 2 sessions with her before Cannon Beach. I called her from a bench overlooking the water on day 4, mostly because I wanted to hear a professional opinion instead of just my own uncertain one. What you're describing, Dr. Feldman told me, her voice calm and unhurried over the phone, is a pattern family therapists sometimes call the designated giver role. It develops slowly, usually starting with genuine generosity, and it calcifies over years into an expectation nobody examines out loud, until the giver finally says no to something, and the whole system reacts as though a rule has been broken, rather than recognizing that a person simply changed their answer. It felt like I broke something, I admitted, watching a container ship move slowly along the horizon. Cody's voice on the phone. I've genuinely never heard him talk to me like that. You didn't break anything that was healthy to begin with, she said. You interrupted an arrangement that was only working for the people who benefited from your availability. That's uncomfortable, but it isn't the same as doing harm. I asked her somewhat sheepishly whether I should be worried about the actual week Cody and Brittany had described, whether Miles's meltdown or the scramble for a sitter meant I'd genuinely left them in a bad spot. Dr. Feldman was quiet for a moment before answering. There's a difference between a family navigating a hard week and a family in crisis, she said. From what you've told me, this was the former. Children have meltdowns. Families find sitters, even imperfect ones, even expensive ones. What you're describing doesn't sound like negligence on your part. It sounds like a normal, solvable parenting week that simply required your son and daughter-in-law to problem solve without immediately reaching for you first. That distinction mattered more to me than I expected it to. I'd spent so many years unable to tell the difference between an actual emergency and an inconvenience dressed up to look like one, mostly because I'd never had a reason to practice telling them apart. Brittany's own pediatrician, Dr. Adaizo Konkwo, had apparently told her something similar weeks earlier when Brittany mentioned feeling anxious about the childcare gap, that a stressful week of logistics, while genuinely difficult, wasn't the same category of problem as an unsafe or unstable situation for the kids. Brittany relayed that conversation to me herself months later, almost like an apology she hadn't quite known how to phrase directly. I missed my grandchildren every single day of that trip, in the specific physical way you miss small, warm bodies climbing into your lap. I also, for the first time in longer than I could actually remember, heard the sound of my husband's laugh 3 separate times in one afternoon, unhurried and easy, and remembered, slowly, the way you remember a song you haven't heard in decades, the woman I used to be before every family emergency automatically became mine to fix. On the flight home, I kept my phone in airplane mode until the wheels touched down in Boise, mostly out of habit at that point rather than any remaining fear of what was waiting. As the seatbelt light clicked off and the cabin filled with that particular rustle of people standing too early, I switched connectivity back on and watched the screen light up. One new message from Cody. I stared at his name for a long moment before opening it, Frank humming quietly beside me as he reached up to grab our bags from the overhead bin. Some tune from the radio stuck in his head like the last week hadn't changed a single thing between us, which, in the ways that mattered most, it hadn't. Frank had simply gotten his wife back for 7 days, the way he'd always deserved to have her. Part of me expected another order dressed up as an emergency. Another version of "don't be be selfish wearing a slightly different outfit. My thumb hovered over the notification for a few seconds longer than it needed to. Mom, I've been thinking about what I said. I was wrong to say it like that. Brittany thinks so too. Can we talk this week? Not about the trip, about all the other stuff. I read it twice, sitting there in seat 14A with the cabin lights coming up around me, and felt something in my chest loosen that had been tight, I think, for longer than just that 1 week. I didn't answer immediately. Dr. Feldman had told me during our last call that I didn't owe anyone an instant response anymore just because an instant response was what they were used to getting. So I let the message sit for the length of the walk through the jet bridge, through baggage claim, through the parking garage where Frank's truck waited exactly where we'd left it a week earlier. Dust settled on the windshield. I texted Cody back that night, once we were home, once the suitcases were unpacked and the mail was sorted, and I'd hugged both grandchildren so hard Miles complained I was squishing him. I'd like that, I wrote. Come by Sunday. Bring the kids. We'll figure out the rest together. But Carol gets a say from now on, not just Mom. He called instead of texting back, which surprised me. That's fair, he said. And his voice had none of the coldness from that Thursday night in it anymore, just something quieter, more careful. I've had a week to think about how that sounded. I don't love how it sounded. Neither did I said, and I meant it in both directions. I didn't love hearing it, and looking back, I didn't love how close I'd come for most of my life to simply absorbing it without a word. Brittany feels awful too, he said. She kept saying, halfway through the week, that we should have asked you back when the schedule first came out instead of waiting. I think we both just assumed you'd say yes no matter when we asked, so the timing didn't feel like it mattered. It mattered, I said. Not because I wouldn't have helped if you'd asked in time, because I would have. I just needed the chance to actually choose it instead of having it decided for me 11 hours before a flight. He was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. I don't think I ever really thought about it that way, that there was a difference. There's a big difference, Cody, I said gently as I could manage. One of them is a family helping each other. The other one is a family assuming one person will always absorb whatever's left over. Sunday came and Cody and Brittany arrived with both kids and a bag of bagels from the place Frank likes, an offering I recognized, even unspoken, as its own small form of apology. We sat at the kitchen table for almost 2 hours, working through what an actual arrangement could look like going forward, 2 set days a week that worked for my schedule, not just theirs, and a firm understanding that anything urgent enough to require more than that would come with real notice, not a countdown clock disguised as an emergency. Brittany was the one who brought up the text itself, the one that had started all of it. I want you to know I didn't write that message, she said, turning her coffee cup slowly on the table without quite looking up. The one about being selfish. That was Cody, and I told him at the time it was too much, but I was also stressed enough about training that I didn't push back as hard as I should have. That's on me too. I appreciate you saying that, I told her, and I did. It would have been easy for her to let the whole thing sit on Cody's shoulders alone, and she hadn't. Cody reached over and put his hand briefly over hers on the table, a small, quiet gesture that told me more about where the two of them had landed on this, privately, than either of them had said out loud yet. I keep thinking about how fast I went to guilt instead of just asking properly, he said, like it was the only tool I had. I don't want that to be the only tool I have with you, Mom. Emma, oblivious to the weight of the conversation happening over her head, was busy building a small tower out of the bagel bag on the floor by my feet, humming to herself the way she does when she's perfectly content. I watched her for a moment and thought about how much I wanted her to grow up believing that love and obligation weren't automatically the same thing, that the people who cared about her most could also sometimes simply say no, and that the relationship would survive it. We didn't fix everything in one conversation, and I want to be honest about that too, because I think stories like this one sometimes promise a tidier ending than real families actually get. Cody and Brittany and I spent that fall building something closer to an actual agreement instead of an assumption, a standing arrangement for 2 set days a week that I chose, an understanding that emergencies would be shared with more than 11 hours of notice whenever humanly possible, and, maybe most importantly, an unspoken but very real shift in how quickly the word selfish got reached for whenever I said the word no. Emma asked me the following spring why I hadn't come on the trip that one time. I told her the truth, in words a 7-year-old could hold on to. Grandma needed a week that was just for her and Grandpa, I said, just like you need days that are just for you at school, doing things that are just yours. She thought about that for a moment, the particular serious way children consider something genuinely new, and then said, okay, I get a week too, someday. You will, I told her, and I hope somebody lets you have it. Frank and I went back to Cannon Beach the following October, a smaller trip, just 4 nights, no anniversary attached to it this time, no particular occasion beyond the simple fact that we wanted to see the gray waves again in a different season. We didn't tell anyone we were going until the week before, not out of spite, but because I'd finally learned that a trip didn't require a defense prepared in advance. Cody watched the kids for a weekend, so Brittany could join her sister on a trip of her own, an arrangement he offered without my having to ask, which felt, in its quiet way, like the truest apology he'd given me yet. I think about Cannon Beach more often than I expected to. Not the itinerary Frank had highlighted so carefully, not even the 7 days of chowder and gray waves, though I loved every one of them. I think about the moment the cardigan slipped out of my hands and landed on the bedroom carpet, blue and gray, while I was still deciding something small small because the big thing had finally arrived and I hadn't yet realized it. I picked the blue one in the end. I wore it on the flight out and I still have it, hanging in my closet. A reminder that some of the most important decisions of my life have looked, from the outside, exactly like a woman standing in her bedroom trying to choose between two ordinary sweaters.